Thank you all for joining us. I expect there'll be more. That often happens as we get going. This is our second night of the Racial Justice Summer Speaker Series. And tonight we are very pleased to welcome John Jacoby. He is a longtime resident of Wilmette. He is a two-term former Wilmette Village President. For many years, he wrote a weekly column for the Wilmette Beacon on local history and issues. And I've just learned he has a book about Wilmette on the occasion of its 150th anniversary that has just come out and is available on Amazon if you want to look for it. And tonight he will discuss his work researching and writing about housing discrimination in Wilmette and help us think about how to be a more just and inclusive community today. So with that, I welcome John and thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be with you all. Several months ago, I spoke to your inclusivity task force, which is a mouthful, about the articles I wrote for the Wilmette Beacon on the history of racism in Wilmette. One of those task force members asked me, why did you write about this subject? I'm afraid I didn't give a very thoughtful answer at the time, but the question got me thinking. A person's attitude about race and racial issues, I believe, is formed by environment and experience and education. As I tell you a bit about my background, think about your own encounters with racism and how they may have affected your attitude and thinking. As to myself, I was born in 1941 in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago, which was my father's childhood home. My parents had recently moved from Englewood to the all-white suburb of Western Springs, but they continued to see their family doctor at Englewood Hospital, which explains why I was born there. All this occurred at the beginning of the white flight from Englewood. In 1940, Blacks were just 2% of Englewood's population, and the percentage was on its way upward, though. It jumped to 11% in 1950, 69% in 1960, and 96% in 1970. Years later, my father's sister, a liberal woman in most respects, lamented the decline of her Englewood neighborhood. She blamed the Blacks without acknowledging how racism contributed to the decline in the white flight. Racial issues weren't at the forefront of my childhood in Western Springs. My father died when I was 7 years old, and I don't have any idea what he thought about this subject. I did notice later, though, that a kid named Ray had autographed my father's 1928 Englewood High School yearbook by drawing a cartoon figure of an African-American with the caption, "Too common a sight at our dear school." So racism was alive and well in Englewood. My mother came from a farming family in downstate Menard County. She was a good Presbyterian church-going woman who lived by the golden rule, but I don't recall ever discussing racial issues with her in any depth. Her parents lived only 7 miles from Lincoln's New Salem State Park in downstate Menard County. And when I visited my grandparents, there wasn't much to do besides exploring New Salem and the nearby county seat of Petersburg, where Anne Rutledge is buried. I was proud to learn that my great-great-grandfather was a neighbor and friend of Lincoln during the 1930s. Lincoln became my childhood hero, the wise and erudite man who began life dirt poor in a log cabin, rose to the presidency, freed the slaves, And as the Civil War drew to a close, he was the best hope for moving the nation toward racial unity. My admiration for Lincoln probably affected the way I saw two events that I specifically recall from my childhood. Slide 1, please. In 1952, when I was 11 years old, a prominent Black physician and civil rights leader, Dr. Arthur Falls, bought property for a home in Western Springs. Some racist neighbors persuaded the Park District to bring a condemnation suit to take the property for a park. This tactic would be repeated in Deerfield a few years later. The incident left a mark on me. I don't recall all the details, but mainly the sense that Dr. Falls was treated inhumanely by people in my hometown who were acting cruelly and ignorantly. Fortunately, a Mattoon judge called up to Cook County to handle the case ruled against the Park District. He explained his ruling in these words: if this land were condemned, it would become a monument to hate and intolerance. Nobody wants to see this. That judge happened to be blind, literally, but his insight was astute. Slide 2, please. The second event occurred while I was a junior at Lyons Township High School. My 1959 graduating class had 623 students, fewer than 10 of whom were Black. Race was probably the furthest thing from the adolescent minds of us white students, except I do vividly recall watching our tiny TV screen in 1957 when National Guard troops escorted 9 Black students into Central High School in Little Rock. President Eisenhower had nationalized the Guard, outmaneuvered Governor Faubus, and achieved the integration of the school. This was the first of several such encounters, but what a shameful image on TV. Hostile white adults shouting and spitting at Black students who needed the protection of soldiers just to enter the high school. After high school, I spent 6 years at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. African-American enrollment at the U of I as a percentage of this total student body was in the single digits then, as it is now. I joined one of the 56 fraternities on campus, not knowing that its constitution and bylaws restricted membership to white Christians. Restrictions like this, both written and unwritten, were common among fraternities and sororities nationwide. And by the way, they were also common among adult civic and social clubs, even here in Wilmette. In the early 1960s, the U of I threatened to kick fraternities and sororities with these restrictions off campus. So in the summer of 1962, as president of the U of I chapter of my fraternity, I attended the national convention in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and voted to repeal the restrictive clause. But Southern chapters dominated the fraternity, so you can guess the outcome. Racism won by a vote of 215 to 76. I attended the U of I's law school from 1962 to 1965. My class had only 1 Black student and 1 woman. The rest were white males. As a member of the Law Review, I wrote an article that was published in 1964, arguing that racial discrimination by fraternities and sororities at state institutions was unconstitutional state action in violation of the Equal Protection Clause. My legal theory was never adopted anywhere by anyone. But my classmates and I spent many hours discussing the social issues of the day, and racial justice was one of the major subjects. Of more concern to many of us, though, was the Vietnam War and the draft. It didn't escape our attention that while we enjoyed deferments to attend school, Blacks were being drafted into the military at a disproportionate rate. That was significantly higher than whites. During my final year in law school, I met my future wife, Muggsy. Her father was a farmer in downstate Bureau County and one of the leaders of the state's soybean industry. Governor Otto Kerner at that time invited Muggsy's father to join a 1965 trade mission to the Far East to promote Illinois commerce, including farm products. And it was a year or so later that Muggsy and I attended a reunion of the trade mission members. At that time, the Illinois General Assembly was debating a controversial housing law, fair housing law, something that Muggsy and I supported. So I asked Governor Kerner about the prospects of the proposed law. I was astounded by his response. While I don't recall his exact words, his message was this: don't worry about the law. Even if it's adopted, they don't want to live with you. Not a very inspirational message. I didn't respond. I spent my entire legal career with a Chicago law firm specializing in labor and employment law. I represented companies as they grappled with the laws and regulations that prohibit discrimination in employment and require affirmative action to advance the employment of members of various protected groups. I learned that laws prohibiting discrimination, while they're necessary tools in the quest for racial justice, are sometimes imperfect in their outcomes. While it's indisputable, in my opinion, that racial discrimination is widespread in America, it's often not so clear that discrimination occurred in a specific case. Meanwhile, Muggsy and I moved to Wilmette in 1974 to an area called Connecticut Village. It consists of 39 homes along Ashland and Richmond Lanes. I noticed a restrictive covenant in the proposed deed for the house we were buying. It limited ownership to Caucasians. But knowing that such restrictions are unenforceable under the Supreme Court's 1948 decision in Shelley versus Kramer, I asked that the covenant be removed. And it was not a problem. I eventually became a village trustee and village president. As village president, I initiated a new procedure setting annual goals for the village board. At the time, I was disappointed and unhappy that outsiders regarded Wilmette and other North Shore communities as havens of white, bigoted rich folks. I hoped that the village board could do something to change both the image and the reality. So one of our 1999 goals was to take measures to assure that Wilmette is a community which is open to persons of all races, religions, and national origins. This goal eventually led to the creation of the Wilmette Human Relations Commission, the adoption of a logo symbolizing the goal, and other activities intended to promote racial unity. Slide 3, please. That's the logo, which fell into disuse. It seemed like progress was impeded by apathy and undermined by isolated incidents of bigotry. Our efforts during the 1990s may have changed some attitudes, but the African American population of the village, under 1%, didn't change significantly, and the effort waned. In 2010, I started writing a weekly column for the Wilmette Beacon. This activity gave me the opportunity to tell stories about Wilmette's past and express an opinion or two about current issues. At that point, I was disappointed that the Human Relations Commission that we had established in the 1990s had become inactive, and the village wasn't actively projecting a racially welcoming stance. My weekly column gave me the opportunity to refocus the community's attention on this subject. I believed that if racism is a part of Wilmette's past, the present day community has a responsibility to deal with its lingering effects. So I did the research and I found that, yes, Wilmette's past does indeed include racism. I decided to write a series of articles with the hope that knowledge of the past would motivate residents to become more aware and involved. No one else had explored the issue at the time, but here's some of the evidence I found. It includes some highly objectionable language, which I hope you will understand is from the original source, not from me. The village's African-American population probably never exceeded about 225. And that was the number that was reported in the 1940 US Census. Only 2 African-American families, the Smiths at 1428 Wilmette Avenue and the Mitchells at 1822 Wilmette Avenue, or Walnut Avenue, lived in the village for any extended period of time. During the village's early years, the African-American population consisted mainly of domestic employees like maids, cooks, and chauffeurs, although many Wilmette families refused to employ non-white domestic employees. The first of Wilmette's numerous white-only help wanted ads that I found was published in 1912, and the last almost 50 years later in 1961. Slide 4, please. This particular one was published in the Wilmette Life on May 30, 1936.
Wow.
In 1904, the Chicago Tribune reported that the towns of the North Shore, Evanston, Wilmette, Winnetka, and Glencoe, were aroused and alarmed over the influx of Negroes. Evanston citizens proposed a solution: create a town for Negroes to be located near Niles Center, which is now Skokie. To this, it is proposed to deport objectionable characters. In August 1913, a 7-room house on Elmwood Avenue near Ridge Road in Wilmette was sold to a small colony of Negroes. Actually, it was 2 families. Residents of the area paraded through town and petitioned the village board to provide relief from unsanitary conditions in an overcrowded house. The petition added, "We respectfully request that each citizen use his influence to prevent further bringing into the village of Negroes, particularly with the real estate dealers handling property in Wilmette, to induce them to cease selling or renting to undesirable people. The village board referred the petition to a committee. Slide 5, please. Now, this is a newspaper article reporting on this whole incident. It was published by the Chicago Tribune on August 10, 1913. The dealer who sold the property in that situation was threatened with a boycott, and a white-only citizens group, the Wilmette Civic Association, was formed for the purpose of keeping African Americans from residing or working in the village and eliminating nuisances. Real estate dealer Milton Barker was identified as the culprit who sold the property. He admitted it. In fact, he admitted selling 2 houses to African Americans, but only as investments, he says, not as residences. He promised not to transgress again. It wasn't just Blacks living in Wilmette that riled up the citizenry in 1913. It was also Blacks working in Wilmette. The few African Americans employed in Wilmette were mainly domestic servants, but the riled up villagers found even this small percentage to be unacceptable, as reported by the Buffalo Inquirer and other newspapers. Slide 6, please.
Wow.
Isn't that an interesting article to be reported by the International News Service and published around the world? The following year, an African-American janitor at a building in the village received a death threat for bringing Negroes to this village to work. The note demanded that he leave within 2 weeks. The unwanted employee lived in Evanston, where he was the first Negro scoutmaster named in the Boy Scout movement and is in charge of a troop of more than 30 colored boys in Evanston. In 1918, a white resident, intending to strike fear in his neighbors' hearts, publicly threatened to sell his Sheridan Road lakefront property to African Americans if whites wouldn't pay his price. 10 years later, when a house on Locust Road was sold to an African American family, neighbors denounced the real estate firm thought to be responsible. The firm defended itself, not by standing on the principle that race should be irrelevant in real estate transactions, but by insisting that it sold the house to a white flipper who quickly resold it to the African American family. In other words, bad, but not my fault. The law at that time didn't prohibit housing discrimination. Instead, it recognized the right of property owners not to sell to African Americans. Restrictive covenants in some deeds prohibited homeowners from selling to African Americans and others. But even without these covenants, a gentleman's agreement among homeowners and real estate brokers had the same effect. Real estate brokers acknowledged that they wouldn't show properties to African Americans because of the owner's explicit instructions, or because they assumed this was the owner's desire, or because they believed that the neighbors and community opposed integrated housing, or maybe because of their own bias and fear of rocking the boat. In 1951, a prominent Wilmette broker was hired to sell the house at 1424 Wilmette Avenue, which was next door to one of the few Wilmette homes occupied by African Americans. The white owner and broker assured neighbors that the house wouldn't be sold to colored people, but the neighbors were dubious. After the sale to a white purchaser, the broker wrote to her client, "Well, I guess by now the folks in the neighborhood of 1424 are convinced that we were not going to sell to colored people. We feel so happy about it and know you do too." As late as the mid-1960s, local brokers aggressively defended the right to discriminate. Even the community's good works were tainted. During the first half of the 20th century, Arden Shore was a prominent North Shore charity that provided summer respite to Chicago area's poor women and their children at a lakeside camp in Lake Bluff. Its supporters included many leading Wilmette citizens. A 1936 article about the camp bragged that it admitted all races with the exception of Negroes. Minstrel shows were a popular form of entertainment. They portrayed African Americans as stupid, lazy, and comical. A 1909 show was staged by the Wilmette Country Club, predecessor of Michigan Shores Club. Later shows were sponsored by churches, social organizations, and other groups in the community. They featured prominent citizens and children as blackface actors. The Wilmette Historical Museum's collection includes a 1941 photo of 5 women in blackface for a minstrel show presented by the Wilmette Women's Club. Slide 7, please. Now, who were these people? Well, they were the backbone of the community, starting on the left and without using anything but their initials to protect their descendants. Mrs. G.A. was age 54, a longtime Wilmette resident, active in the Women's Club and the Wilmette chapter of the Order of the Eastern Star. Mrs. R.E., age 37, was a longtime Wilmette resident. As a member of the Women's Club, she was chair of its Red Cross production unit during World War II. Miss R.F., 41, lifelong Wilmette resident. Besides her involvement in the Women's Club, she helped found the Glenview Announcement newspaper in the 1940s and served as editor until her retirement in 1950. Mrs. H.F. was 45 years old. She was a longtime Wilmette resident. Besides the Wilmette Women's Club, she was a soprano who performed at the Century of Progress World's Fair and elsewhere around the region. Mrs. D.V., age 43, was a longtime Wilmette resident. She was the founder and president of the Wilmette PTA, president of the Wilmette Girl Scout Council, officer of the Wilmette Women's Club, president of the Wilmette Garden Club, founder and first president of Wilmette Council of Garden Clubs, and trustee of the Wilmette Library Board for 14 years. The average age of these women was 44 years old. They were pillars of the community, and they were the good people of the community under the standards of the day, but they were certainly insensitive to the racism that they were spreading and reinforcing among members of the community, including its children. 10 years later, in 1950, 2 women in blackface again were pictured on the cover of the Wilmette Life, promoting the American Legion's upcoming minstrel show at the Wilmette Women's Club. Now turn to the library for a moment. In 1938, the Wilmette Public Library presented a puppet show in the children's room. Slide 8, please. Intended to teach children about Negroes, the show was set in a cotton patch and featured Dinah, dressed in a red calico dress, a headcloth, and a white apron with a basket of clean wash on her head, and Mammy, who cradles a white baby on her arm. The event also promoted several children's books dealing with Negroes, as was said, that would be seen today as blatant reinforcements of racial stereotypes. Crime reports in the local newspaper, the Wilmette Life, typically identified African-American perpetrators, unlike white perpetrators, by race. A 1914 item reported, the Negro, who was armed with the usual weapon used by that race, a razor, slashed his victim around the head and body, inflicting serious but not fatal wounds. African Americans who achieved success were also identified by race, as if to suggest that their accomplishments were somehow especially remarkable and rare. In 1935, two performers at upcoming concerts were described by the Wilmette Life. And these are their words: Marion Anderson, Negro contralto, and Albert Spaulding, American violinist. Marion Anderson was born in Philadelphia and was one of America's most acclaimed singers of the 20th century. Wasn't she as much of an American as Spaulding? This history of racism is well documented. But I'd ask you to imagine how much else there was that isn't documented. But there's another side to Wilmette's racial past. Let me tell you about 4 Wilmette residents who had a positive impact. Most current residents probably have never heard of them. They deserve to be recognized. Martin Bickel, Pat and Patty Crowley, and Buckner Cole. These 4 residents were leaders not just against racial injustice, but also against poverty, unemployment, war, lack of affordable housing, and other social injustices. They aroused the good people. They changed some people's attitudes about race. Slide 9, please. This is Dr. Martin Bickel. He was a recognized leader of the civil rights movement in Illinois. In 1943, Governor Dwight Green appointed him chairman of the newly created Interracial Commission, charged with studying the growing racial conflict and making recommendations. It was the first human rights commission in the nation and the forerunner of today's Illinois Department of Human Rights. Dr. Bickel wrote and spoke extensively on social issues. In the 1960s, he helped organize the Wilmette Human Relations Committee. Slide 10, please. These folks are Patrick Crowley and Patricia Crowley, husband and wife. They were the first co-chairs of the Wilmette Human Relations Committee. They had previously founded the Christian Family Movement, called CFM, which grew into a worldwide organization of over 100,000 couples in America and abroad. Slide 11, please. This is Buckner Cole. He was the young pastor of the First Congregational Church of Wilmette during the 1960s. He was one of the Wilmette Human Relations Committee's most outspoken leaders, and much of his time was spent in activities in opposition to racial discrimination, poverty, and the Vietnam War. His congregation was progressive, but some members believed he was going too far. Sensing his lack of support, Reverend Cole resigned from his position as pastor in May of 1966. The congregation voted 246 to 220 to ask him to stay. He returned, but only for a short time. These leaders and other members of the Wilmette Human Relations Committee sought to bring about open housing in Wilmette and elsewhere on the North Shore. What did they accomplish? Perhaps the committee's biggest undertaking was the North Shore Summer Project that brought Dr. Martin Luther King to Winnetka in 1965. The Summer Project involved much more than Dr. King's speech. Slide 12, please. This article deals with a petition that was circulated, signed, and published to publicize the fact that many residents of the North Shore support open housing. More than 10,000 people signed the petition. A survey conducted during the summer project revealed that housing discrimination was as much the fault of real estate brokers as property owners. Slide 13, please. The summer project ultimately led to the adoption of Wilmette's open housing ordinance in July of 1968. One of the early ordinances of this type in Illinois, something that Wilmette can be proud of. It prohibited discrimination in the sale and rental of homes, whether by brokers or property owners. The committee also engaged in outreach activities. Slide 14, please. One of these activities was hosting Black kids in Wilmette homes for 3 weeks while they attended District 39's Summer Enrichment Program. Another outreach activity was a series of Come Live in Wilmette events. Slide 15, please. The committee invited minority group members from all over the Chicago area to day-long events in Wilmette, including a tour of the village, a visit to several homes, and dinner at the home of a committee member. You'll notice that this article notes that the committee member in question for this event was Robert and Jean Cleland. Jean Cleland is a name that is now attached to the affordable housing residence that's now going up in Wilmette. This Sunday, the revived Wilmette Human Relations Commission will hold a community engagement session to start a conversation, it says, about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's at the Village Hall at 1 p.m. I'm pleased that the committee is doing this, but I do quibble with the idea that the conversation is just starting. It's been going on in one degree or another for over 60 years. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
John, I have a question, Ms. Bob Malmstrom. You look around Wilmette nowadays, and we've been here since 1976, and I haven't seen any increase in the African-American population. In fact, I rarely see an African-American person. I'm unaware of some living in the village. Do you think that's due to some type of either direct or indirect discrimination, either by residents or realtors? What would be your best explanation as to why we have no African Americans or very few?
Well, first of all, you are correct that there are very few African Americans in the village. As I noted, the population of African Americans in the village has always been less than 1% of the total population. I do believe that discrimination, not only in Wilmette, but in the region, does account for much of this. It could also be argued that there's an economic factor at play too, but I think that is exaggerated and is sometimes cited more to excuse than to explain. You know, I recounted specific incidents that can be proved of racial bias that existed in Wilmette. People of color who might be interested in moving into Wilmette and who were aware that this was going on were not going to move into Wilmette. So it's a complicated explanation as to why we remain under 1% and probably never achieved more than the 224, whatever the number was, that is shown in the 1940 census. I am a little pleased to note that the number has gradually, infinitesimally increased in the last 2 or 3 censuses.
I'm assuming you're not aware of any recent litigation over the period that you've been living in Wilmette in which there was a claim of discrimination with respect to a potential sale to an African-American family?
No, and I think that the real estate industry has cleaned up its act.
Okay.
I think that they're very cautious now about, they would never take a listing that was a restricted listing. They would never, well, I suppose there could always be an exception, but I think most real estate brokers and agents are fully aware of their legal obligations and are very cautious not to take improper steps beyond what the law allows.
Sure.
John, I was wondering if I'm remembering your presentation correctly. The open housing, anti-discrimination for selling houses was in the late 60s in Wilmette, that law. And you bought your house in 74 that had the clause in the deed. Do you think that some of those clauses could exist in deed today?
I think that what happened was that, as lawyers do, the old deed was copied and the covenant appeared in the deed as it had previously. It wasn't a new covenant. It was the old one brought down for my transaction. And it was, you know, as soon as I mentioned the point, everyone agreed that the clause could be eliminated because it had no effect.
You mentioned this affordable housing building in Wilmette that's under construction now. Where is that?
That's the old American Legion building. It's at near the intersection of Wilmette Avenue and Ridge Road.
Oh, I knew that had been blocked for a long time. I didn't realize that was going forward.
Yeah, there's 2 buildings going up at that intersection. One is a memory care facility, but to the west of that is the old American Legion building, which has now been torn down, and you'll see the affordable housing facility under construction.
that Come Live in Wilmette event, was that current or was that in the past?
No, that was all part of the activities of the Wilmette Human Relations Committee, which was founded in the 1960s and continued to operate for a decade or so.
Can you talk a little bit about the affordable housing unit that's going in? How big is it? I mean, how many units are involved? And has there ever been any movement in Wilmette to just put in affordable housing as opposed to, just regular housing that's typically very pricey?
I did know the number of units in that affordable housing facility that's going up at Ridge and Wilmette Avenue, but I forget, it's something like 16.
Oh, okay.
And affordable housing has been a concern for a long time, that Wilmette lacks affordable housing, and the number of affordable housing units in the village has actually declined because people are coming in and tearing down the more affordable houses and putting up more expensive ones.
Yeah.
And the state of Illinois has put pressure on all municipalities to try to increase the stock of affordable housing. The Village of Wilmette has adopted an affordable housing plan, which is, I think, under review and may be revised, the object of which was to increase the number of affordable housing units by getting them built in multi-unit residences. That, to me, hasn't been working, and that's why it's a good thing that the plan is under review. The new building that will go up at Central and Green Bay Road, where the bank used to be, the savings and loan, and then the International Bank of the World, or whatever it is. That project involved the developer pledging to create a number of off-site affordable housing units, probably by purchasing some that are available elsewhere in the community, fixing them up, and then probably renting them out.
Okay.
So something has been done, but more attention needs to be devoted to the question. But also, I think that people who view the lack of affordable housing as the reason for the dearth of African Americans in the village are kidding themselves a little bit. We in Wilmette have much to offer. And there are probably hundreds of thousands of African Americans in the state who have the means to live in Wilmette, but they choose not to. And why is that? And I think it goes back to what we've talked about already.
Which is that Wilmette is not a welcoming place for Blacks to live?
That Blacks do not regard it as a welcoming place to live. And also, there aren't very many African Americans here. And so the outreaches and connections that possibly draw people to a place to live don't exist because there are so few African Americans living in the community now.
Great.
Although I know,
Oh,
go ahead, I'm sorry.
yeah, please go ahead.
I was getting a great presentation. Thank you. This is Steve Reinhardt. Just wondering your thoughts, because so Evanston certainly has a much higher African-American population than Wilmette. Obviously, it's not uniform across the city, but I mean, do you think, I'm trying to think of like, Wilmette is this first white line at the North Shore, like, but it kind of faded up from Evanston. But do you have any sense of, why Wilmette was more effective at being racist, or how did Evanston, or what was the interplay between those two? Just curious about your thoughts, having been here a while.
Yeah, I don't have an explanation for that. There was a reason why a Black community developed in Evanston, and I'm not expert enough to explain that. Whatever it was didn't exist in Wilmette. I would mention, though, that Glencoe had a significant African-American presence for a while. That's a whole different story, but
Yeah.
Interesting.
I was curious, John, although you made reference to it now, whether the whole North Shore, starting with Wilmette, Kenilworth, Winnetka, Glencoe, maybe even up to Highland Park, whether the story of the discrimination and the unwelcoming of African Americans is kind of a consistent theme in those, although you mentioned now that Glencoe might be an exception. And maybe you haven't looked at these other communities in your study, but we're focused primarily on Wilmette, but I thought I would ask you if you knew anything about these other suburbs.
you know, I didn't look at them in the same detail that I looked at Wilmette. I would venture to say that the Winnetka Talk contained white-only ads for domestic employees just as much as Wilmette. I think Kenilworth has always been regarded as being white-only. There was a very serious incident of racism in Kenilworth a few years ago when a cross was burned in the lawn of an African-American doctor who had moved into the community. There are incidents like that that are inexcusable, but don't necessarily represent, and don't represent, in my opinion, the prevailing thought of the community. And yet you get tagged with reputation because of what those few people do.
When did that incident occur? The
I
cross
beg your
burning?
pardon?
When did that incident occur, the cross burning?
I believe it was
Very-
in, yeah, I believe it was, it's within the last 50 years.
Oh,
And
okay.
it wasn't within the last 30. So I'd say 50 to 30 years ago, or in
Okay.
that time frame. Yeah.
Mhm. As you wrote your article and brought these issues more and more to light, what was your, how was that received in the community? And have you noticed any change in that reception since?
Well, first of all, I thought it was well received. I didn't receive any hostile response to it. And a lot of people were glad that I had done it. Nobody else had done it yet. I don't know why, somebody didn't jump at the opportunity to study and report on, an issue that I think is fairly obvious. But in any event, now I think people are paying more attention. And if I had something to do with it, I'm pleased. If I didn't have anything to do with it, at least I didn't hurt the situation.
Right.
So John, do you know of any active organizations or committees in Wilmette right now that are working towards racial justice and racial reconciliation, racial healing?
In Wilmette?
Yeah.
Well, just recently, the history is that the Wilmette Human Relations Commission that we established in the 1990s was allowed to atrophy. And it had, for several years, it hadn't met and it didn't even have a full complement of members anymore, but that didn't matter because it wasn't meeting, wasn't doing anything. And so the village board very recently decided to reactivate it. And now it is newly staffed with a number of citizens who are very prominent in the field of human rights and are, I think, very well qualified to pick up the ball and run with it. And as I say, they are having their first public input session this Sunday at the Village Hall, outdoors from 1 to 3 in the afternoon. And all residents are invited to go and tell them what they think.
And Steve has provided a couple of links to some of these questions in the chat, if anyone didn't see them, so you can learn more. Well, we're just at 8:30, and are there any questions before we close?
I have one quick question not
Mhm.
totally related to the topic. I'd be interested in reading your book, John. There was an earlier history of Wilmette that you used to be able to buy at the Village Hall. Is your book available there, or do I have to only go to Amazon? Is that the only place?
No, it's not the only place. The book you're referring to is the Bushnell book on the history of Wilmette. That is available at the Wilmette Historical Museum. It
Okay.
doesn't really get into this issue at all. I mean,
Right.
my book is available online at Amazon and on the publisher's website. I'm having an event this Sunday right across the street from the other one I just mentioned, where, I'm introducing the book and, kind of publicizing it. And I'll have copies for sale there. But, and I have purchased some that I'm reselling, and for anybody who's desperate, they can get a hold of me and
Okay.
John,
I'll be able to provide one.
When is that event?
I'm sorry?
When is that event? The Sunday, where and when?
The village event is at the Village Hall, Sunday, 1 to 3 on the lawn. My event is at the coffee shop across the street. Incidentally, mine was scheduled first.
Same time then.
Yeah,
And it's from 2 to 4.
Oh,
So
yeah. Okay.
Is that on Wilmette Avenue?
it's on Wilmette Avenue, right? Or no, Central Avenue.
John, I was going to say that you're missing an opportunity when you watch the shows on like Sunday, like Fareed Zakaria or whatever, whenever he has somebody on, they have their book in the background. You should have the book.
I'm reaching. Well, you'll like the cover of my book. It's a beautiful aerial photo of the Baha'i Temple,
Okay.
which
Oh,
I regard as the main landmark of Wilmette, but also a important symbol of unity. That faith, if you're familiar with it, emphasizes the unity of all mankind, all religions, so forth. So that was the reason I selected it.
Okay.
I look forward to that. Well, John, thank you so much. This was a really fascinating presentation and very thought-provoking. Thank you so much for all of the time you took to be with us.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.
And we'll look for your book.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.